Chapter 4. Sara stopped atop the main street bridge, looking below at the ice to see if it looked thick enough to walk across. She spotted a few birds standing on the ice and noticed some rather large dog tracks in the snow on the ice. But she didn't think that the ice was quite yet ready for all of her weight, including her heavy coat, boots, and a rather hefty bag of books. Better wait a bit, Sarah thought, as she peered down the icy river. Leaning way out over the ice, supported by the rusty railing, which Sarah believed was there just for her own personal pleasure, and feeling better than she had felt in a long time, she decided to stay for a while to look at her wonderful river. She dropped her book bag to her feet and leaned against her rusty metal railing, Sarah's favorite place in the whole world. Resting and leaning and appreciating this spot, Sarah smiled as she remembered the day this old railing was transformed into the perfect leaning perch by Mr. Jackson's hay truck when he slammed on his brakes on the wet, icy road to avoid running over Harvey, Mrs. Peterson's dachshund. Everyone in town talked on and on for months about how lucky he was that his truck didn't go right into the river. Sarah was always surprised at how people were always making things seem bigger and worse than they really were. If Mr. Jackson's truck had gone into the river, well, that would be quite different. That would justify the big fuss everyone made. Or if he had gone into the river and had drowned, that would have been even more reason to talk. But he didn't go into the river. As far as Sarah could figure out, no harm had come from it at all. His truck wasn't damaged. Mr. Jackson's wasn't damaged. Harvey was frightened and stayed home for several days, but he wasn't hurt in any way. People just like to worry, Sarah concluded. But Sarah was elated when she discovered her new leaning perch. Large, heavy gauge steel posts were now bending way out over the water. So perfect. It was as if it was made especially to please and delight Sarah. Leaning out over the river and looking downstream, Sarah could see the great log stretched across the river, and that made her smile too. That was another accident that suited her just fine. One of the big trees that lines the riverbank was badly damaged in a windstorm. So the farmer who owned the land gathered some volunteers from around town, and they trimmed all of the branches from the tree, getting ready to cut it down. Sarah wasn't sure why there was so much excitement about it. It was just one big old tree. Her father wouldn't let her get close enough to hear much of what they were saying. But Sarah heard someone say that they were worried that the power lines might be too close. But then the big swords started buzzing again, and Sarah couldn't hear anything else. So she stood back at the distance, with most everyone else in town, to watch the big event. Suddenly, the swords were quiet, and Sarah heard someone shout, "Oh, no!" Sarah remembered covering her ears and squeezing her eyes closed tight. It felt like the whole town shook when the huge tree fell. But when Sarah opened her eyes, she squealed with delight as she got her first glimpse of her perfect log bridge, connecting the little dirt path on each side of the river. As Sarah basked in her metal nest, hanging right out over the river, she breathed deeply, wanting to take in that great river smell. It was hypnotic. The fragrances, the constant, steady sound of the water. "I love this old river," Sarah thought, still gazing at her big log that was crossing the water downstream. Sarah loved to put her hands out for balance and see how quickly she could scoot across the log. She was never frightened, but she was always mindful that the slightest slip could take her tumbling into the river. And Sarah never crossed the log that she didn't hear her mother's cautious, uncomfortable words playing in her mind. "Sarah, stay away from that river. You could drown." But Sarah didn't pay much attention to those words. Not anymore, anyway, because she knew something that her mother didn't. Sarah knew that she couldn't drown. Relaxed and at one with the world, Sarah lay in her perch and remembered what had happened on that very log just 2 summers earlier. It had been late in the afternoon, and all of Sarah's chores were done, so she had gone down to the river. She had leaned in her metal perch for a while, and then she had followed the dirt path down to the log. The river, swollen from the runoff from the melting snow, was higher than usual, and water was actually lapping up over the log. She had debated whether it was a good idea to cross over. But then, with a strange sort of whimsical enthusiasm, she decided to cross her precarious log bridge. As she got near the middle, she paused for a moment and turned sideways on the log with both feet pointing downstream, teetering back and forth only slightly. As she regained her balance and her courage, and then, from out of nowhere, came the pit-filled mangy mud Fuzzy, bounding across the bridge, happily acknowledging Sarah, and bumping up against her with sufficient force to topple Sarah into the very fast-moving river. "Well, This is it, Sarah had thought. Just as my mother warned, I'm going to drown. But things were moving too fast for Sarah to give too much thought to that. For Sarah found herself on an amazing and wonderful ride as she floated rapidly downstream on her back with eyes looking upward, seeing one of the most beautiful views she had ever witnessed. She had walked these river banks hundreds of times, but this was a point of view very different from what she had noticed before. Gently carried on this amazing cushion of water, she could see blue sky up above, framed by perfectly shaped trees, denser and sparser, thicker and thinner. So many beautiful shades of green. Sarah wasn't aware that the water was extremely cold, but instead she felt as if she were floating on a magic carpet, smoothly and quietly and safely. Wow, these trees are beautiful, Sarah said right out loud. She had never walked this far downstream. The trees were lush and lovely, and some of their limbs were dipping right down into the river. And then a long, friendly, solid limb seemed to reach right down into the water to give Sarah a hand up. Thank you, tree, Sarah said sweetly, pulling herself out of the river. That was very nice of you. She stood on the river bank, dazed but exhilarated, and tried to get her bearings. Wow, Sarah murmured as she spotted the Petersons' big red barn. She could barely believe her eyes. In what had seemed to Sarah like only a minute or two, she had floated over 5 miles through pastures and farmland. But Sarah didn't mind the long walk home one bit. With delicious enthusiasm for life, Sarah walked and skipped her way home. As soon as she could get out of them, she put her dirty, wet clothes in the washing machine and hurriedly ran a nice warm bath. No point in giving Mother one more thing to worry about, she had thought. This won't make her feel safer. Sarah lay back in the warm water, smiling as all sorts of leaves and dirt and river paths washed out of her curly brown hair. Knowing with certainty that her mother was wrong, Sarah knew that she would never drown.